gosh, why am I doing this? Just to consistently be bombarded by people's expectations and call to failure.
Blessings to you in the name of Jesus Christ, and welcome to Pastors for Pastors, the podcast that supports and celebrates pastors. I'm your host, Ken Broman, folks, and you are in for a treat with this episode. We continue a series of programs today on the stages of ministry, what it's like to be a pastor from seminary to retirement and after. We're talking with pastors from each decade of ministry, and today we're talking with 5 pastors in their first decade of ordained ministry. They'll introduce themselves, but I want to at least name them before we begin. Taylor Barner is Associate Minister for Youth and Young Adult Ministries at First Presbyterian Church in Burlington, North Carolina. Kate Morrison is Solo Pastor of John Calvin Presbyterian in Salisbury, North Carolina. Jeff Smith is the pastor of First Presbyterian in Boone. And Wes Pitts is the pastor of First Presbyterian in Reedsville, North Carolina. And finally, Caroline Sell is Associate Minister at Westminster Presbyterian in Greensboro, North Carolina. Negotiating the transition from preparation to practice, developing their pastoral identity where people begin to treat you differently and place different expectations on you, as well as so much more. These experiences are anything but easy, and these 5 share what it has been like for them. The conversations are so inspiring and insightful that I could not edit them down to just one episode. So this is part 1. Part 2 will be released next week. Thank you again for joining me for this conversation. And if each of you will kind of give us a little bit of background, where you're from, what seminary you went to, what position you are in now, and if this is not the first ministry position since you were ordained, tell us where else you've been.
My name is Taylor Barner. I am the Associate Pastor at First Presbyterian Church of Burlington, North Carolina. I started in that position in 2017. That was my first call. It is my first call, not was, it is. And I graduated in 2016 from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary with a Master's of Divinity degree. I grew up in Pittsburgh, so I am a northerner down here in the South. Burlington, though, has become a home, and I'm quite thankful for it. So
Great. Kate, how about you?
So I am originally from North Carolina. I grew up in Statesville, where my parents still reside. I graduated from seminary in 2016. I was that student that did a 4-year program, and so I graduated with my Master's of Divinity and Master's of Arts in Practical Theology, which was concentrated in Christian education. Did I say I went to Columbia? Columbia Theological Seminary right outside of Atlanta. I loved my time in Atlanta. That's the biggest city I've ever lived in. It was great. But right after seminary, I moved for my first call to a small town in Torrington, Wyoming, where I was an associate pastor for youth and young adult ministries, and worked with the youth in town, but also they had a local college where I did some campus ministry stuff. And then just over 2 years ago, now I moved back to North Carolina. I am now in Salisbury and am serving John Calvin Presbyterian Church as their solo pastor and head of staff.
So I will be here at First Presbyterian Church in Boone 7 years this August in a solo call of about 350-ish members. I was ordained in February of 2012. I went to Union Presbyterian Seminary in Charlotte, so I did the 6-year seminary while you do ministry thing, and had been serving in Spartanburg, South Carolina as a youth ministry director there for 6 years, and then was called to Eastminster Presbyterian Church to serve as an associate pastor there. So I was actually wrapping up seminary serving sort of in an associate role. We called it pastoral associate from a semantic point of view, serving in that role before I was actually called and ordained into it. And so I've been in ministry now for 21 years, having graduated from Montreat College and served a small church in Bennettsville, South Carolina. And my calling here is unique because I grew up here. This is my hometown. And I think we all know what Jesus said about hometowns and prophets who show up. So it's different because I am now teaching and pastoring those who taught me in high school, those that I grew up playing Little League baseball and basketball with. And so it's a unique call in that regard. It was not my home church growing up here, so that I think is the saving grace.
So I am at First Church in Reedsville, so just 30 minutes north of where Caroline is. And I took the position in October of 2019 and was ordained in January 2020. But similarly to Jeff, before I took an ordained position, I was serving in ministry at First Statesville. I went in as a part-time youth director, and that developed into full-time Christian educator, and that developed into kind of a pseudo associate pastor, although in name only because it wasn't allowed because I was still trying to finish the process. So I think right now I'm still only at a year, just over a year in ordained ministry, but my previous experience in the church in Statesville, where I was for 5 years, I hit that wall, that 5 year, where it was like I very much felt like maybe this isn't for me. This has been such a difficult 5 years that I don't know if God is continuing to call me to ministry or church pastoral ministry in a congregation setting. After a long discernment process and seeking, deciding that I will go continue into pastoral ministry, it has been, had it not been for the pandemic, things might be different, but it's still hard, but for very different reasons, right? The pandemic has just been incredible challenge after incredible challenge, especially in a solo call where I just started to get to know people before, suddenly I don't see them at all. A predominantly elderly congregation, so it's been a year where I can't have interaction. Especially I've had COVID, and so don't want to risk killing members of my congregation to spend time with them. So new challenges, and I can see where that study, that 5 to 8 years, may continue to be true.
So if I understand what you're saying, that really has rung true for you of a process of kind of reexamination. Is this where I am being called?
Yeah.
And I appreciate you sharing that. Caroline, how about you? Tell us how long you've been in ordained ministry, where you went to school, where you are now, and your experience of these first years in ministry.
Yeah, so thanks Ken for the invitation, and grateful to hear Jeff's story too. So I've had kind of a unique path directly out of seminary. I went to seminary at Princeton Seminary up in New Jersey, met my now husband there. He graduated a year before me and took a call as a chaplain at an all-boys high school in Baltimore. And so following my graduation, I was looking for calls in that area and ended up taking a call, which was a surprise to me, as working in residential life and chaplaincy at an all-girls Episcopal boarding school, and was ordained into that as validated ministry. So I spent my first 2 years out of seminary doing a lot of community life work with high school girls from around the world, really, which was neat and had a great deal of challenges. as well. And my kind of sense of call to church and parish ministry never really went away, which is why I only was there for 2 school years, coupled with us looking for opportunities to come back to North Carolina, where I grew up. I'm in Greensboro now, but grew up in Winston-Salem. So I've now been at Westminster in Presbyterian in Greensboro for about 2.5 years. I started in a temporary supply position, and then toward the end of my second year, following an open search, was called into an installed position. So kind of been it's funny you sent that quote, and I thought, I'm not even sure. It's almost been 5 years since I've been in ordained ministry, but I don't know that I can really resonate with that quote yet, because I've had 2 such different calls. And, I came to Westminster thinking it was going to be a temporary thing, thinking it really was a move just to get back into this area, and being surprised that ended up being a real call situation. And then the pandemic, and we had our first child last year. So I just don't know if I can even say that I've settled in enough to resonate with that quote yet. But yeah, it's been a great place, and glad to be now starting to kind of have a mindset that this call will be for a while, I hope.
I will say yes, definitely. I think it's always interesting the expectation piece that people have of you as a pastor, and especially myself as a young clergy woman. It's just it's so interesting. But I think as I was kind of reflecting on this, I am that person. I always try to write down some little things so I have notes. But I think when it's asked, like, will we get to this point and we're like, well, what are we doing? I know for me, it was actually more of like, gosh, why am I doing this? Just to consistently be bombarded by people's expectations and call to failure, and, not living up to these expectations that people have. And that can get to you. I mean, I don't think people understand sometimes how personal their comments can be, and how deeply cutting it can be. And well, hello, Tally. But I think sometimes people forget that pastors are people too. And I mean, so I've had a lot of those experiences where people have said things to me that they don't think are offensive, that I'm kind of like, okay, we need to try and do you understand what you actually said, and how that actually, yeah, like that's been more my experience of it, is that it's kind of I've gotten into a mindset of like, well, geez, why would I want to do this if I'm constantly going to be dealing with this for, however long I am in ministry. I certainly know that that's a number of the reasons why a number of my colleagues have left within the first 5 years of ministry. I think one of the things that I've learned very quickly in ministry is that no matter where you go, no matter who you are, there are always going to be people who don't like you, or who will not give you a chance, and they will leave. And no matter how much time you spend trying to reach out to them or help build or form a pastoral relationship, they just aren't interested. And at a point, I have to come to myself and say, well, that's more about them than it is about me. And I have the rest of a congregation to care for in this moment. So I need to do that, and I need to do that to the best of my abilities. And not saying that I'm going to let this person fall by the wayside, but, there are other places that I can direct those energies right now than worrying about whether or not people like me.
Right. And focusing too much of your attention there does cause you to not focus on the other areas and the other people.
It's been really good. I was very unsure coming in to do this. Um, there's a lot of things that in a larger church where you're an associate that you don't do, and you have an area of ministry that is particularly yours, and so you have to learn how to do certain things that you haven't been given the permission to do in a larger church, and you're kind of thrown into it. So it's baptism by fire. In some ways it's just fine to learn that way because it forces you to learn quickly. But it's been a very good fit. It's a very loving congregation, and that love is mutual, and it's been a joy, really.
How about you, Taylor?
Yeah, certainly in some respects. And I think in my experience, actually, some of it was brought on by myself, actually. I brought a lot of self-doubt into, which I think a lot of people do, into their first couple years of ministry. Even throughout seminary, I really struggled with this sense of calling to ministry in general, let alone youth ministry and campus ministry. But when my first year down in here in full-time ministry was I was a workaholic. I really overburdened myself. I would wake up, come to work well past the hours that I was supposed to set for myself, and I come home and just not do a whole lot of self-care and building connections, which is something I love to do. I get a lot of energy from being around people, and that element of self-care just wasn't there that first year, especially. And I remember going into my first personnel staff review, and the only critique I hadn't been there for super long, just a handful of months. So there wasn't a whole lot to say, but the one thing they said is you need to take more time off. And I was like, there are worse things you could be told. But for me, that was really revealing. It was, I wasn't taking care of myself. I was so concerned with the responsibilities that had been placed on me, and it kind of hit me. It did hit me like, man, here we are. We're boots on the ground. Let's go. And at the same time, though, it's not that intense. It's my congregation has been so loving and so caring, but I have experienced, Kate, like what some of the stuff that Kate was talking about. Being called reverend was the most off-putting thing to me. It still is, but I understand it. It's a title that it's not necessarily earned, but it's one that people look to, and it's one that bears that responsibility and bears it well. We might not bear it well all the time, but there is something to this calling that I found out very quickly was a joy in that responsibility, and thankfully after that first year, after being able to travel a little bit more, staying in contact with friends, and getting connected more to the community itself here, not just the church but the community around it, really helped me to get out of that rut that I had dug somewhat for myself and that had kind of been dug for me. And I credit that to a lot of different people, but I would say overall, I've experienced that burnout. I've experienced that to a degree, but I think I've come out of that, what I have experienced, confident in where I am, more confident than I was when I started, and I credit that to kind of going through that period of time where I wasn't as confident in myself. And it took a little bit of trial and error to figure out what exactly it looked like and what it needed to look like, and who I could rely on to get me through those times. So
let's follow that thread about self-care and the things that each of you have learned or are learning that you need to do for your own physical and mental and spiritual health. and wellness. What kind of things have you learned, Taylor, out of that overworking and maybe some burnout? And Kate, perhaps the same thing has been true for you. I know it certainly was for me in my first call. I had to learn to step back, and it's great. I should say, Taylor, that your church told you that you need to do that, because sometimes it's much more difficult when they're not telling you that, and you realize you need to do it anyway.
Yeah, for me, as somebody who I would define myself as an extrovert, coming to a place where I didn't have really anybody nearby that I could see in person that I knew, it really pushed me to get involved in the things that I'm passionate about, as a way of self-care, which has always been something I do. I love sports. I love getting out, being active, going for runs. But there wasn't as much of that comfortability level, and so I had to really. It involved a lot of vulnerability, to practice self-care in that way. In other ways, it was needing a space to vent, feeling able to talk to somebody that wasn't a church member. Maybe there were other. For my first couple of years, it was other colleagues in ministry who were spread out throughout North Carolina and across the states, and sometimes that involved just going over to Elon University and hitting volleyball against the wall for a couple of hours, just getting the stress out, getting the frustration out, and not really keeping it bottled up. One of the biggest aids to me throughout my ministry thus far has also been staff. The staff that we work with are critically important. There are relationships that need to be cared for just the same as there's relationships in the church, personal relationships, friendships, partners and spouses. The same thing goes for the people that we work with, especially in this profession. It's one in which we can either work with one another or work against one another. And I've seen aspects of that, not here at First Pres Burlington, but throughout some of the other places that I worked at, where sometimes personalities clash and sometimes there's some drama, but a good, healthy church staff works together and supports one another and builds one another up. And I've been very thankful in that regard and very blessed in that regard to have that. Because just today, I went to my head of staff and was like, I really need to talk to you about this thing. It's been bugging me for this entire last week that you were away, and I hated to just drop it on his doorstep the first day he comes back. But that's the kind of relationship that's been built, and the trust and the camaraderie that we share is one that supports and uplifts rather than divides and separates.
Yeah, it's interesting though. So in my first call, it was the smallest town that I've ever lived in. I mean, so it was a town of roughly 2,000 people.
So you went from Atlanta to a town of 2,000 people.
Talk about culture shock. Yes, it was. That was a big thing. I feel like I did really well kind of early on. One of the things I do and continue to do to this day is, barring that there are no emergencies or anything that pops up, I block Friday and Saturday. So everything is done, hopefully, before Thursday night. Usually most of my stuff, I know our church board, our session, in the Presbyterian Church USA, our session meets at 6:30 on Thursday. So usually during the week, if they're meeting, that's the last thing that I have during a week. So I intentionally block Friday and Saturday, with one of those days being my Sabbath day, whichever it works out to be. If I've got other stuff going on, it switches back and forth. But one of those days is very intentionally my Sabbath day. And what I mean by that is that's the time where I do the things that help me relate and feel closer to God. And that changes from time to time. I'm a huge proponent of adult coloring. So I have coloring books and markers and all that type of stuff. I just like to doodle, so I doodle a lot, and that helps just kind of whatever comes out. Um, a more recent thing that I've gotten into is Legos. I love them so much. So right now I've got two it's actually beetles where you build essentially the face of one of the four Beatles, so John, Paul, George, or
Oh,
Ringo. And
wow.
I've got two of those that I need to do, so that will be that will be becoming one of my practices sometime soon. So things that just help me kind of relax and feel centered and mindful. There's a very historic cemetery right up the road from me, which is just beautiful to walk through. Very much like Taylor, I consider myself an extrovert, so um, I enjoy being out in spaces where even if I'm not, sitting and having a conversation with people, I'm still surrounded by people. It's been a lot easier being in Salisbury, even though I have moved into the solo pastor role because there's so many colleagues here in this area, whether they're here in Salisbury themselves or they're just a little bit away. That has been so nice. Just be able to say, "Hey, I'm having a rough day. Can we grab lunch? Can we grab coffee? Can we go for a beer?" Like, and that has just been such a godsend in so many ways and has helped me in um, yes, in just very profound ways. And the last thing I'll say is I was also and am also very blessed to have wonderful mentors in my life. And specifically, I'll just before I took my first call, I remember talking to one of my mentors, and she was just like, "You know what? These are the things that you need to be intentional about." So she was kind of one of the people that said you need to block that time where you can have a Sabbath day and then have a day where you can go do all the errands that you need to do, like any other person gets. Um, and so I'm really grateful that I've had some of that tutelage along the way, just to things that I wouldn't and didn't think about as a person coming into ministry, but has been hugely formational in how I have been able to fill my cup.
I wasn't diagnosed with COVID back in March of last year, but I'm pretty sure it was. The tests were pretty bad then, and I developed a secondary issue. Took 6 months to discover I was gluten intolerant from that, and so I lost about 22 pounds in 2 months, and was not physically myself, and so I'm just now getting back to the point of feeling like myself again. Winters in Boone can be a mess, and so like if you run, then good luck if you want to run on ice or snow. But so I have a basement, and I've converted it into a home gym. I purchased an exercise bike. I've got weights and a little home gym system that was given to me by a church member. And I do the Peloton app, and I don't have a Peloton bike. I am a pastor, but I have been doing that weekly, and that has been really helpful to just physically exercise and to get cardio in my house, even though I can't get out and do that. I'd much prefer to be outside running or hiking or that sort of thing. So that has been a blessing. And then Kathy Beach, pastor at Rumpel, she and I have been connecting ever since she came here. And so from a pastoral standpoint of care, providing care for one another and listening to one another and talking about ministry or frustrations or joys and that sort of thing, we haven't gotten into a book study or anything like that. I was a part of that at my last church with a group of pastors, but it's kind of isolating in the western part of the presbytery. We're not as close, so it makes it harder to do some of those things. And then just scriptural daily readings and prayer, coffee time. That's one thing the pandemic has provided some flexibility in, is to have mornings where I don't have to rush to get up and I can get that in.
So I have a couple of things that I do. For one, I have a therapist, and I have a regular appointment, which is not so much to deal with mental health struggles, but to just process and unwind, and to make sure I maintain mental stability, which is wonderful. I also run regularly, although that hasn't been true over the last couple of months, and so like I'm really feeling that need. But after getting COVID and have had a couple of health things that have followed, including some chest pains and having to go through this whole long testing process to make sure there's nothing wrong with my heart. You know, that has been a huge blessing in my life to be able to run. And I went from running 25 miles a week to I haven't run in like 3 months now, but getting back into that will be helpful. When I am doing that, I feel like I am my best on a mental and spiritual and physical level. And also having people I can reach out to and have a relationship with that are not in the church to unwind, which is obviously another thing that's been really hard during a pandemic because you can't see people. I live in an area where people are seeing one another anyway, except for me and my family, and so that's very isolating. So a couple of things that I would typically have that I don't have right now, but they are mainstays.
So, I resonate with a lot of what Wes and Jeff both said. I've definitely been struggling, since Allie was born, as I have a ministry coach right now that I'm doing some coaching with. So I've gone back and forth between coaching and sometimes therapy and others, spiritual direction. Having someone to process with, depending on the season of life and the needs, has always been very important to me. But I told my coach just to do, work well, be a wife, to be a mom, to then eat well and exercise. Like, it feels like I cannot check all of those boxes off. And I think that's a very normal feeling, especially when you're kind of have young children. And so our current mantra is not new, but it's something is better than nothing. So, yesterday I think we made it through 20 minutes of the yoga video until Allie was jumping on my back. And it was time, and then pulling my hair, and it was time to turn it off. But you know what? Something was better than nothing. So just working on that right now, because I'm definitely a perfectionist, and a kind of either I'm all in training for something, running wise, or I'm not doing it at all. I'm all in with, a book group or a study group, or I'm not doing it at all. So just trying to work on that balance is a goal right now that I have for myself to lead toward increased wellness.
Speaking of mentors, is that something that you all have continued to foster?
I will say yes. I met my mentor when I was in seminary, and she was actually then the wife of one of my professors. But we have continued to foster, even though she's now moved all the way across the country. She preached my ordination. That'll be 5 years in July, and we continue to be in touch relatively consistently, and I certainly know she's one of the first people I call when I'm having a ministry crisis where I'm like, I need to run this by someone before I
renounce my ordination.
Yeah, or not even that, but I'm gonna see if this person knows, so or at least give me some direction. So
how about you, Taylor? I saw you nodding your head.
So I've stayed in touch with a lot of my mentors, but the one who I've probably stayed in touch the most with was actually it's an interesting relationship that we have, because he was my youth director or not my youth. He was the youth pastor at the church down the street from the one that I went to, and then we ended up graduating seminary together. Yeah, he came. He was going. He went to seminary part time over a number of years, and I happened to be in his graduating class ultimately. But his name's Jason Fryer. He's a pastor at Laboratory Presbyterian Church in PA. And I had numerous other mentors throughout seminary. Martin Ankrum at First Pres Greensburg, PA. Marnie Silbert, who was at my home church, Newlandsburg Presbyterian. And I've stayed in touch. I've stayed in touch with these people, but I always look back to Jason actually as the person who got me to build confidence in my call. During that period of self-doubt, Jason had invited me actually to be the speaker for one of his youth retreats, which I had never done before. And after that, we stayed in pretty good contact, and those are relationships that are important. I haven't talked with some of my other ones as much, but they're still very cherished relationships that have been built. And when I was taking a look at calls, it came down actually to two different churches. There was one in Philadelphia and then this one here in Burlington, and both were wonderful churches. But when I got to meet with the head of staff at both, I felt that mentoring environment continued here in Burlington, and that was something that we talk a lot about, being called into various places. Some of them feel right. Some of them feel a little tougher, maybe to conquer. That there's some more obstacles that might be in the way. But that feeling of this is a place where I'm going to continue to grow is, I think, of critical importance. Not necessarily where am I going to teach the best, but where can I also grow with my congregation and my fellow colleagues and friends and family. Where are those relationships and values going to be nurtured and allowed to sprout and bloom and blossom? So, but yeah, no, I've loved. I would not be who I am today. I would not be where I am today without numerous people. But those particular ones in ministry have always been very cherished, and I still stay in contact with them.
Yeah, I think having that 5 years in Statesville was a really great place to develop that. Steve Scott was the senior pastor there, and his tenure ended about 3 years into mine, and so there was really good relationship that we formed, and continue to be friends, and he continues to be a mentor. But then I had, to kind of combine, I had a couple of clergy friends in the area who would help me also kind of decompress as a place to just have that someone else to bounce things off of, that if I didn't want to go to Steve. But then I also was given the opportunity because he left, and then there was a good 4 month period where there was no senior pastor. They hadn't gotten an interim yet. And so everyone looked to me to do things. And so I got to build on what I had learned. And even when the interim came, it was a chance for kind of some mutual stuff to happen. And so both of you, or Ken, you said you're doing your very first funeral, your first week. My last 10 months in Statesville before I had even gone into ordained ministry, I think I did 15. And so I got a lot of those things out of the way, fortunately, with the help of other people, retired pastors in the community who would step in and help, other pastors who would take part in, Steve, and other folks. And then here in Reedsville, I immediately joined in with a pastors group, two of them, that meet on a fairly regular basis. One stopped meeting in the midst of the pandemic. The other has continued to meet virtually. And having that weekly meeting, we say we're a book group. So I did that Ken Bolsinger workshop on, was that Tuesday? And we read his book at the very beginning of my time joining with them. And we can say we continue to read books, although during the pandemic, we've really just been offering care to one another and mentoring one another through ministry in the midst of a difficult time.
Yeah, I've been fortunate every move that I've made in ministry to have mentors. I'd say a general weakness of mine is staying in touch with people from one chapter of life to the next. That's friends, that's mentors, and everyone in between. That's a consequence of my strengths, which are developing deep relationships where I am. And I found it hard to do both. But I have always found people, whether it was here or in Baltimore or New Jersey or Chapel Hill before that, who I really trusted where I was, who I could look to and have coffee with and turn to for advice, and have coveted that everywhere I've been.
So I told you a story in the email I sent you about my first day moving my stuff into my office, and the secretary comes over to my office and says, "Well, if whatever you need me to do, let me know." And my first thought was, I have no idea what I'm supposed to be doing here. I couldn't guess what I'm supposed to have you doing here. I'm just wondering if you all had any experiences similar to that as you came on field and right out of seminary and into that first call.
I definitely did. And I am still, this is one of my worst skills is delegating responsibilities to other people. And so when I first came in, I remember sitting with Ron, my head of staff, and he said, "Go ahead and pass this off to Kathleen, who is our church secretary." And I thought, I'm not going to make her do this. Like, and it wasn't like here, you can give all this stuff to this person or this person to make them do it. It was like trusting and relying on other people to take care of that. It was something that was foreign to me. It was something that I didn't understand how to do, and I still do struggle from times, but. And not necessarily it wasn't a trust issue. It was just more of the weight of the responsibilities that had been taken on. I felt that I was responsible for everything, and recognizing that space is available for us to lean on one another and to rely on one another and trust one another. Even the simplest thing to something that might be a little bit more complex. That was new. That was hard to grasp for me. And along with the weight of, I have a business card, and I am going to be, if I ring somebody's doorbell just to visit with them, they're going to let me in without even, I've been here for a week at best. And building those relationships and establishing trust we think is something that takes time, but it's something that I think in ministry, it comes very quickly. And if we're not ready for it, it catches us by surprise.
So I think for me, obviously there were those feelings when I first stepped into my office, and I'm kind of in my first call. As you had mentioned, Ken, earlier, I had served other churches before I was ordained in a variety of capacities. So it wasn't so much like kind of at the beginning of all of that, I kind of felt like, okay, I'm just settling into a new position. Like we're just going to get settled and start doing all the pastoral relationship building, all that type of stuff. I remember distinctly probably the first time I can remember where it hit me was when my head of staff had an emergency, and I had to moderate the session meeting, moderate the board meeting, and we might touch on this later. That was one of the things I felt my seminary did not prepare me for, was proper Robert rules of order following. I mean, I'd been to meetings before. I kind of knew how they worked. I'd obviously observed on many occasions, but to actually run that first meeting and making sure that I had everything, um, that I had. I think I remember Googling like Robert Rules of Order for Dummies, like just to try and get myself up to speed and all that. But I was so nervous. I just remember being so nervous. I'm gonna botch this. It's gonna be awful. The session's gonna hate me. Um, but it
They're going to have to undo
yes,
everything I did
they're gonna
wrong.
yeah. It's years later they're still gonna be talking about how this was the worst session meeting in the history of session meetings. Um, but it was probably one of the most grace-filled moments of my life, just because everyone was like, "We know that it's your first session meeting. It's okay." And thankfully we also had a really wonderful clerk of session at that time, and we were all just kind of like, okay, well, we're going to do this to the best of our abilities, and may the evils of the day be sufficient thereunto. Um,
Right. And a good clerk of session can clean up the mess and make it look like it was done decently and in order, right?
exactly. But it ended up, there were no contentious issues. There was nothing. It was all just kind of in my head of, you're just going to botch this. But in that moment, it was kind of like, or once we were in the meeting, um, it was definitely that moment of grace where people were like, you're going to be fine. Like, you're going to be fine. And just remember, this is the first in a long line of session meetings that you will probably lead in your life. And I kid you not, 2 months later, uh, two congregations about 30 miles away, their pastor left and they called me to come and moderate both of their session meetings. So I was like, well, okay, we're going to get the practice that we
Well,
need.
you're experienced. You're a veteran now.
Right.
You've done it once.
That immediately resonated with me. I feel like there are people, it's not just my secretary, but other people in the church who come to me all the time and say, if there's anything I can do for you, please let me know. And I have that same internal dialogue thinking, well, I don't know what I'm doing, so how can I tell you what to do? I'm still figuring this thing out. Uh, Before being in a much larger staffed place, even though I wasn't in an ordained position, there was having someone above me to tell me what to do had was kind of nice sometimes because I could go to them and say, listen, I'm lost, let's work on something. And now there's nobody, it's me. um, so it's a unique kind of experience. It's freeing on one hand to just be able to listen and discern and act, and on the other hand, it's absolutely terrifying because there are days that I don't know what I'm doing at all, and I feel like I don't know. But then there are other moments where I feel so grounded and like this is exactly where I was supposed to be because, God put me here for a reason.
Well, I'm kind of in that associate role that Wes was just mentioning, and so I am fortunate right now to still have someone that, and you all probably know Ernie Thompson at least a little bit, and he's just the best listener and mentor I could ever dream of, and so I'm very comfortable going to him and asking for advice, and also just kind of floating ideas, and I simultaneously feel heard while also kind of being offered direction. And I think that's just a real skill set that he has. So probably in this call, the most overwhelmed I've felt was maybe 6 months in or so when I transitioned to really overseeing all of our worship planning and leading kind of a worship planning staff meeting each week of 8 to 10 people, and then the worship committee, and kind of trying to rein in all of our great ideas while also being open to creativity. And just that was probably the most overwhelmed I felt, is about a month into that, feeling like I was getting pulled in so many directions. But now, having done that for about 2 years and done it through a pandemic, I feel like I've started to at least have an idea of how to lead that aspect of our ministry. And that's to think of a 1,400 member church that the senior pastor led the 32-year-old, 31-year-old new associate kind of really own our worship planning is pretty remarkable. And so I'm thankful for that chance and the opportunity to learn through moving through that period of feeling overwhelmed to now over the last 2 years has been a gift.
For me, kind of like with Caroline, my associate call was really helpful. It helped me jump into things that I had not done in a non-ordained role in the church before. So I was doing baptisms and weddings and funerals and serving communion and providing pastoral care. So moving into this call, those things were normal for me. That wasn't anything that I was concerned about. It was moderating a session meeting, leading officers training, moderating a congregational meeting. And so God took care of that real fast because my very first Sunday, the Sunday after, is when I had to run the congregational meeting to elect the newest officers that the nominating committee had and lead my first session meeting that evening. And then in addition to that, I was caught off guard in my first week that apparently one of our officers at the time was accused of sexual misconduct with a minor. And so my very first conversation with the session revolved around that, of which I had never dealt with before. So I was thrown into, the fire the moment I walked in the door, and all the things that I was scared about leading were the things I was having to lead the moment I began. And but God was gracious and helped guide and get us through all of that together. And so I don't think I had time to think, what am I doing, or what do I need to be doing? I was having to do the moment I walked in the door, and instinct kind of kicked in, and but also just having good mentors and pastors that I've served with to be able to call and say, I don't know what to do, I need help, guide me in this, and that was helpful to have those close relationships with former pastors that I could lean on and say, just give me some advice and some guidance here.
One of the most common experiences reported by many pastors is loneliness and isolation, and it's so good to hear that these 5 have been mature enough to reach out to mentors and mental health professionals to stay healthy. Next week, we'll continue our conversation as we talk about the unexpected joys and sorrows they've discovered, how the pandemic has impacted these early years of their ministry, and how seminary did and did not prepare them. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for joining us, and thank you for your leadership of Christ's body. Until next time, I'm Ken Broman, folks, and this is Pastors for Pastors.